The wind hit different at 8,000 feet. Jonas Fletcher learned that his first November in the Wind River Valley, 1834, when ice crystals formed on the inside of his cabin walls and his water bucket froze solid 3 feet from the fireplace. He'd built the cabin the way every trapper in the Rocky Mountains built them. Logs stacked tight, mud packed between the gaps, stone fireplace at one end. Standard construction. Everyone did it that way. By February, he'd burned through more firewood than any 3 men should need for a winter. His hands were raw from splitting logs. His back ached from hauling them. And still the cold seeped through those walls like they were made of paper. Worse, when spring finally arrived and the valley warmed, that same cabin turned into an oven. The thick log walls that couldn't hold warmth in winter somehow trapped every bit of summer heat, making sleep impossible and turning the interior into a sweat box. Jonas wasn't alone in this problem. Every trapper, settler, and frontiersman building cabins in the mountains faced the same brutal reality. The standard cabin design that worked reasonably well in the plains and eastern forests became nearly unlivable in the extreme temperature swings of the high country. Summer days could hit 90 degrees. Winter nights dropped to 30 below. The same structure had to handle both, and traditional construction methods failed at that task more often than they succeeded. What Jonas discovered over the next 3 years would quietly spread through the mountain communities of the Rockies, changing how trappers and early settlers built their winter quarters. He didn't invent any of the individual techniques. Various methods had existed for decades, borrowed from different sources. But Jonas combined them in a specific way that addressed the unique challenges of high-altitude living. The result was a cabin that stayed noticeably warmer in winter and cooler in summer, using less firewood and providing actual comfort in conditions that usually offered none. The story of how he figured it out involves a Swedish trapper, a Shoshone woman who thought white men built ridiculous houses, and Jonas's own stubborn refusal to spend another winter freezing or another summer sweltering. It's about understanding how heat actually moves through a building, about working with materials available in the wilderness, and about the difference between building a cabin and building a home you can actually live in for years. Jonas Fletcher wasn't anyone special. Born in Virginia in 1809, he'd worked as a carpenter's apprentice before the lure of the fur trade pulled him west. He joined a trapping brigade heading for the Rockies in 1833, part of that wave of young men chasing beaver pelts before the trade collapsed. He had some building experience, which was more than most trappers could claim, but he knew timber frames and board construction, not log cabins. The first structure he built in the Wind River Valley reflected that inexperience. He'd picked a good spot, southern exposure for maximum winter sun, a cold spring nearby, timber close enough to haul logs without breaking his back. The valley walls provided some protection from the worst winds. Every practical consideration checked the right box. But when it came to actually building the cabin, Jonas made every mistake a first-timer could make. He cut his logs in late summer when the sap was still running, didn't season them properly, stacked them with the bark still on because removing it seemed like extra work, used whatever chinking material was handy, clay from the creek bank, moss from the shaded areas, even grass stuffed in the bigger gaps. Built his fireplace on the north wall because that's where the ground was flattest. Constructed the whole thing in 3 weeks, proud of his speed. That cabin taught him lessons the hard way. The unseasoned logs shrank as they dried, opening gaps between them that no amount of chinking could permanently fill. The bark held moisture, encouraging rot and providing homes for insects. The clay chinking cracked during the first hard freeze, then crumbled away. The moss dried out and fell out in chunks. The grass-stuffed gaps became highways for mice. And that north wall fireplace meant the fire's warmth flowed toward the coldest part of the cabin, while the living space stayed frigid. But the worst problem was something Jonas couldn't see or understand at first. The cabin had no thermal mass inside the insulated envelope. The stone fireplace sat against the outer wall, so half its warmth radiated uselessly to the exterior. The log walls themselves conducted heat away faster than the fireplace could replace it. On the coldest nights, Jonas could literally watch frost creep across the inside of the walls, despite keeping the fire roaring. Come summer, those same walls absorbed the day's heat and released it all night long, making sleep impossible. Jonas spent that first winter burning 4 cords of wood a month, 3 times what it should have taken. He spent the summer sleeping outside on the ground because the cabin was unbearable. He knew something was fundamentally wrong with how he'd built the place, but he couldn't figure out what. The answer started coming together in the fall of 1835, when a Swedish trapper named Niels Bergström stopped at Jonas's cabin while passing through the valley. Niels had been in the mountains since the early 1820s, one of the old-timers who'd seen everything and survived it all. He looked at Jonas's cabin with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was seeing. "You're cold here," Niels said. It wasn't a question. Jonas didn't bother denying it. "Colder than I've ever been. Can't figure why. Logs are tight mostly. Got a good fireplace." Niels walked around the structure, studying it from different angles. He pushed on some of the logs, checked the chinking, looked at how the fireplace was positioned. Finally, he shook his head. "Your cabin is built backwards. You have made the fire warm the ground outside instead of the floor inside. The cold lives in your walls instead of staying where it belongs, outside." Jonas had no idea what that meant. Niels explained it in the straightforward way of someone who'd figured out these principles through hard experience. Heat, he said, moved in specific ways. It radiated from hot surfaces like a fire or sun-warmed stone. It conducted through materials, faster through some than others. And it rose, which was why the ceiling area of any cabin stayed warmer than the floor. The problem with Jonas's cabin was that every one of these heat movements worked against him. The fireplace radiated half its warmth to the outer wall, which conducted that heat straight outside. The rising heat escaped through gaps near the roofline, which Jonas hadn't sealed properly. The log walls, which seemed solid, actually acted as moderate conductors. Not terrible insulators, but not good ones either. And the cabin had no mass inside to hold warmth after the fire died down. In the old country, Neil said, we learned long ago how to keep warm. You build the heat storage inside the house, not outside. The fireplace must be in the center, or at least not touching the outer walls. The mass of stone must be surrounded by the warm air, so it holds that warmth and gives it back slowly through the night. He went on to explain that the best cabins he'd seen in the Rockies were built by trappers who'd learned from their mistakes, usually after suffering through multiple winters. They positioned fireplaces in the interior when possible, or at least built them with significant mass extending into the living space. They used double wall construction in the coldest areas, 2 layers of logs with packed earth or moss between them for insulation. They sealed every gap with proper chinking, using materials that wouldn't crack or fall out. And they built with properly seasoned logs that wouldn't shrink and open new gaps. Jonas listened carefully. He'd already started planning his second cabin to be built before the next winter arrived. Everything Niels told him contradicted the standard wisdom he'd followed before. But that standard wisdom had left him freezing and miserable. He decided to try something different. The second piece of knowledge came from an unexpected source. That same autumn, a Shoshone woman named Morning Crow came through the valley with her husband, a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste Moreau. They stopped at Jonas's cabin to trade, and Morning Crow took one look at his setup and laughed. "White men build cold houses," she said, in the mixture of Shoshone, French, and English that served as the common language of the mountain trade. "You make walls that breathe out warmth like old man breathes out life." Jonas was getting tired of people telling him his cabin was terrible, but he was also smart enough to listen when someone who'd survived winters in this country had advice to offer. Morning Crow explained that her people didn't build with logs the way white trappers did. When they made structures meant to last through winter, they used what she called 2 skins, an inner wall and an outer wall, with air or insulating material trapped between them. The principle was simple. Air is actually a reasonable insulator as long as it doesn't move. Trap air between 2 barriers and it couldn't carry heat away. But if you just had a single log wall, the air on both sides of it was in direct contact with the wood, allowing heat to transfer through constantly. Add a second barrier with trapped air between, and you dramatically reduce that heat transfer. Morning Crow described how her people used bark, hides, or woven mats to create double-layer shelters. She explained how they dug lodges partially underground in the coldest regions, using the earth itself as insulation. And she mentioned something Jonas hadn't considered, that a structure could be designed to work with the seasons, staying warm in winter and cool in summer, if you understood how the sun moved and how air flowed. "In summer," she said, "you want the hot air to leave. Make openings high where the hot air goes. Make shade on the sunny side. In winter, you close the high openings. Make the hot air stay inside. And you keep the earth warmth beneath your floor, not let it go away outside." Jonas spent the rest of that autumn and early winter thinking about everything Niels and Morning Crow had told him. He thought about heat moving in different ways, about trapping air, about positioning the fireplace where its warmth would stay inside instead of escaping. He thought about double walls and proper materials. And he thought about his own carpentry background, which gave him skills most trappers lacked. By December, he'd worked out a plan for a new cabin. He'd rebuild from scratch, using everything he'd learned. The construction would take most of the following summer, but it would be worth it to have a structure that actually worked with the mountain climate instead of fighting it. Jonas started cutting logs in late fall of 1835, when the sap had retreated and the wood would season better. He cut twice as many logs as he'd need for a standard cabin because his design called for double walls in critical areas. He let the logs sit through the winter, stacked with spacers between them to allow air circulation. By spring, when most of the moisture had left the wood, he began construction. The first major change was the foundation and floor. Jonas's original cabin had sat directly on the ground with a packed earth floor. The new design incorporated stone foundation piers at the corners and midpoints, raising the entire structure about 2 feet off the ground. This created a crawl space that served multiple purposes. It kept the bottom logs from ground moisture and rot. It provided a buffer of air between the cold earth and the living space, and it allowed Jonas to store items that needed to stay cool in summer, but protected from deep freezing in winter. The floor itself was made from split logs, puncheons, laid flat side up over thick support beams. This created an actual wood floor, which was much warmer underfoot than packed earth, and provided better insulation from the cold below. The air gap in the crawl space, combined with the mass of the wood floor, created a thermal buffer that kept the living area noticeably warmer. The second major change involved the walls themselves. Jonas built the main structure with large, carefully fitted logs. Each one debarked, and he hewn flat on top and bottom where they contacted each other. This was more work than using round logs, but it created much tighter joints with fewer gaps. But he didn't stop there. For the north and west walls, the sides that faced the prevailing winter winds, Jonas built a second wall 2 feet inside the main wall. This inner wall was made from smaller logs, also hewn flat. The 2-foot gap between the walls was filled with a mixture of materials. Dried moss at the bottom, then a thick layer of dry leaves and forest stuff, then more moss, then a final layer of clay mixed with grass. The idea was to create multiple layers of trapped air and insulating material. The east and south walls didn't get the full double wall treatment, because they faced the winter sun and less severe weather. But Jonas did these walls much more carefully than his first cabin, using a specific recipe he'd developed. The base layer was small split wood pieces wedged tightly into the gaps. Over this went a mixture of clay, sand, and cow hair. He traded for a bag of hair trimmings from a settler's ranch down valley. The hair reinforced the clay, preventing cracks, the sand added structure, and the clay provided the seal. But Jonas added one more element to his chinking recipe: lime. He'd learned from another trapper that mixing a small amount of lime into clay chinking made it more resistant to water damage and cracking. The lime created a mild chemical reaction that hardened the mixture and made it more durable. Jonas didn't understand the chemistry, but he understood results. His chinking, with its wood backing and lime-enhanced clay-sand-hair mixture, proved remarkably durable through temperature swings and weather. The third major change was the fireplace and chimney. Instead of building against the outer wall, Jonas positioned his fireplace in the interior, about 4 feet from the north wall. He built the firebox and hearth from carefully selected stones. Flat ones for the firebox floor, rounded river stones for the upper structure. But the key feature was the mass. Jonas built the fireplace structure much larger than strictly necessary for the firebox itself. The stone chimney was thick and wide, creating significant thermal mass inside the cabin. He extended stone benches out from each side of the fireplace, creating places to sit that also served as additional heat-storing mass. The entire structure probably weighed 4 or 5 tons of stone, all positioned in the interior of the cabin where its stored heat would radiate into the living space. The design principle was straightforward. Fire a hot blaze for an hour or two, heating all that stone. The stone absorbed the heat, then slowly released it over the next 8 to 10 hours. This meant Jonas could let the fire die down to coals or even go out completely, and the cabin would stay warm from the radiant heat of the stone mass. He'd effectively built a battery for warmth, charging it up periodically rather than maintaining a constant fire. The chimney incorporated another clever feature. Jonas built it with a slight bend about 5 feet up from the firebox. This created a trap for rising smoke and heat, forcing it to interact with more stone surface before exiting. The result was better heat extraction from the smoke and less warm air escaping up the chimney. A stone damper near the top, which Jonas could partially close when the fire was low, further prevented heat loss while still allowing smoke to escape. The fourth major element addressed ventilation and seasonal adaptation. Jonas built small openings near the roofline on opposite walls, east and west. In winter, these stayed closed with fitted wood plugs sealed with clay. In summer, he removed the plugs, allowing hot air to rise out of the cabin naturally. This created airflow that made summer temperatures much more bearable. He also designed the roof differently than standard cabin construction. Most trappers' cabins had low-pitched roofs that barely shed water. Jonas built a steeper pitch which served multiple purposes. It shed snow more effectively in winter, preventing dangerous loads from building up. The steeper angle created more space between the ceiling and the roofline, adding an insulating air gap. And it allowed him to add a layer of sod over the split wood shingles, creating additional insulation and thermal mass. The sod roof was something Jonas had seen used by settlers on the plains, adapted for the mountain environment. He laid split cedar shakes as the base layer, then spread several inches of clay over them as a moisture barrier, then added a thick layer of good soil held in place by wooden frames at the eaves. Grass and wildflowers grew in this soil, their roots binding it together. The result was a living roof that insulated beautifully, absorbed summer heat before it could penetrate the cabin, and held winter warmth inside. The fifth element involved windows and the south wall. Jonas built his cabin with the main door and 2 windows on the south side, facing the winter sun. The windows were small, glass was expensive and fragile, but positioned to let in maximum light during the low sun angle of winter. In summer, when the sun was high in the sky, wooden awnings over these windows provided shade, preventing the interior from overheating. Inside, Jonas positioned a stone slab beneath each window. These slabs, about 3 inches thick and extending several feet into the room, absorbed winter sunlight during the day. As the sun warmed them, they stored that heat and released it through the evening and night. This passive solar heating, combined with the thermal mass of the fireplace, meant Jonas needed much less firewood to maintain comfort. Construction of the new cabin took Jonas most of the summer of 1836. Other trappers passing through the valley watched his progress with interest and skepticism. Building with double walls seemed like unnecessary work. The massive interior fireplace looked strange compared to the standard end wall placement. The sod roof drew particular comments. Most trappers thought it would leak or collapse. Jonas ignored the skeptics and kept working. By early September, he'd finished enough of the structure to move in, though he spent the next few weeks completing details and fine-tuning the chinking. The first real test came in October, when an early cold snap hit the valley, dropping nighttime temperatures below zero. Jonas lit his fireplace in the afternoon, building a hot fire that ran for about 2 hours. The stone mass heated up, radiating warmth throughout the cabin. By evening, when the fire had died down to coals, the interior temperature was noticeably comfortable, warm enough that Jonas didn't need his heavy coat, something that had never been true in his old cabin. He let the fire go completely out around midnight and went to sleep. When he woke at dawn, his breath still formed mist, but the cabin was nowhere near as cold as it should have been. The stone fireplace was still warm to the touch. The walls showed no frost on the interior. The temperature had dropped, certainly, but much more gradually than in his old structure. Jonas relit the fire, and within 30 minutes the cabin was warm again. The real test came in January, when the deep cold settled in. Temperatures dropped to 30 below for several days running. Jonas ran his fireplace routine. Hot fire for a few hours each afternoon and evening, then let it die down overnight. The massive stone structure held warmth through the night. The double walls prevented cold from penetrating from the north and west. The tight chinking eliminated drafts, and the raised floor kept ground cold from seeping up. Jonas burned less than half the firewood he'd used the previous winter, and the cabin stayed dramatically more comfortable. He could work on projects inside without gloves. He could sleep without piling on every blanket he owned. The difference was remarkable enough that other trappers who visited immediately wanted to know what he'd done differently. Word spread through the Wind River Valley and beyond. Other trappers began incorporating Jonas's techniques into their own cabins. Some used the double wall construction. Others focused on repositioning their fireplaces to create interior thermal mass. Most started using his chinking recipe, which proved more durable than the standard clay and moss approach. The specific combination of techniques varied based on each person's needs, available materials, and building skills, but the underlying principles remained the same. By 1838, several cabins in the valley featured variations on Jonas's design. A French-Canadian trapper named Remy built a hybrid structure with double walls only on the north side, saving work while still getting significant insulation benefits. A pair of brothers from Kentucky built their fireplace dead center in their cabin, creating a stone mass so large it stayed warm for over 24 hours after the fire went out. An older trapper named Samuels added the sod roof technique to his existing cabin, reporting that it made a noticeable difference in both summer and winter comfort. The summer benefits of Jonas's design became apparent during the hot months of 1837. While other cabins turned into ovens, Jonas's structure stayed noticeably cooler. The sod roof absorbed heat before it could penetrate. The thick walls with their trapped air layers prevented heat from conducting inward. The high ventilation openings allowed hot air to escape. And the stone fireplace, no longer used for heating, actually helped cool the space. The massive stone stayed cool from the winter months and slowly absorbed summer heat, preventing temperature spikes. Jonas discovered he could enhance the summer cooling by opening his door early in the morning when the outside air was coolest, letting that cool air flow in and displace the warmer interior air. By mid-morning, he'd close everything up, trapping the cool air inside. The thermal mass of the walls and fireplace then kept the interior comfortable through the hot afternoon. In the evening, he'd repeat the process, purging accumulated heat and bringing in cool night air. The passive climate control worked remarkably well for a design created with no formal engineering knowledge. Jonas had simply observed how heat moved, learned from people who'd solved similar problems in different ways, and combined those lessons into a functional design. The result was a cabin that maintained relatively stable interior temperatures despite extreme exterior swings. Other innovations spread through the mountain communities during this period, though Jonas didn't claim credit for all of them. Some trappers started building with logs placed vertically rather than horizontally, creating fewer horizontal joints where water could collect. Others experimented with different roof designs, creating steeper pitches or adding ventilated attic spaces. A few built attached shed structures on the north side of their cabins, creating additional wind buffers. The underground cellar became another common feature, though Jonas hadn't incorporated one in his original design. Dug into the hillside behind or beside a cabin, these cellars maintained remarkably stable temperatures year-round, cool in summer for food storage, relatively warm in winter compared to the outside. Some trappers even dug cellars directly beneath their cabins, accessed through a trapdoor, creating additional insulation between the living space and the frozen ground. By the early 1840s, as the beaver trade collapsed and many trappers left the mountains, the knowledge of building climate-adapted cabins had spread throughout the Rocky Mountain communities. Settlers arriving in the region often found trappers' cabins with these features already incorporated, and they adopted the techniques for their own construction. The specific methods continued evolving. Better chinking recipes, improved fireplace designs, more sophisticated ventilation systems. But the core principles remained. Jonas Fletcher stayed in the Wind River Valley until 1843. The fur trade was dying, but he'd come to love the mountains and the valley, where he'd learned his hard lessons about cabin building. He eventually married a Shoshone woman, Morning Crow's cousin, and they raised 3 children in that carefully built cabin. He made his living guiding settlers through the mountain passes using knowledge he'd gained during his trapping years. The cabin itself stood for over 40 years. It survived countless winter storms, summer heat waves, and the wear of daily use. When Jonas finally abandoned it in the 1860s to move closer to one of his grown children, the structure was still solid. Logs intact, chinking holding firm, stone fireplace as sound as the day he'd built it. Other settlers used it for years afterward, recognizing the quality of its construction. The techniques Jonas developed and shared weren't revolutionary in the sense of being entirely new. Double wall construction, interior thermal mass, proper chinking, passive ventilation, all these methods existed in various forms throughout different building traditions. What Jonas did was combine them specifically for the extreme conditions of high-altitude mountain living, adapting knowledge from Scandinavian log building, indigenous construction methods, and practical carpentry. The real innovation was recognizing that a cabin didn't have to be just a box made of logs. It could be designed to work with natural heat flows, to store and release warmth strategically, to adapt to seasonal changes. This required understanding some basic principles of heat transfer: radiation, conduction, and convection. Even if Jonas never knew those formal terms, he understood them through observation and experience, learning from his own mistakes and from people who had solved similar problems in other contexts. Modern thermal engineering would eventually explain why Jonas's design worked so well. The double walls created insulation through trapped air and multiple material layers. The interior thermal mass acted as a thermal battery, storing energy when abundant and releasing it when needed. The sod roof provided both insulation and thermal mass, moderating temperature swings. The elevated floor prevented ground coupling heat loss. The ventilation system allowed for seasonal adaptation. Every element served a specific thermal purpose, whether Jonas fully understood the physics or not. The impact of these building techniques extended beyond individual comfort. Better insulated cabins required less firewood, which meant less time spent in the dangerous, exhausting work of cutting and hauling logs. This gave trappers and settlers more time for other activities: tending livestock, improving their land, or simply resting. Reduced firewood use also meant less impact on local forests, which were already under pressure from overuse. Warmer, more comfortable cabins may have contributed to better health outcomes as well. Constant exposure to cold, as Jonas experienced his first winter, stressed the body and increased vulnerability to respiratory illnesses. Cabins that maintained more stable, warmer temperatures reduced that stress. While frontier life remained harsh and dangerous, small improvements in daily living conditions could accumulate into meaningful differences in survival and quality of life. The social aspect of Jonas's innovations deserves mention too. By sharing his techniques freely with other trappers and settlers, he contributed to a tradition of mutual aid and knowledge exchange that characterized mountain communities. Building a cabin that worked properly meant the difference between surviving winter and freezing to death. People shared survival knowledge because everyone's life depended on it. Jonas's willingness to explain his methods to help understand the principles rather than keeping them secret reflected that communal approach to frontier living. Some of the trappers who learned from Jonas went on to build cabins in other regions, spreading the techniques further. A group of trappers who wintered in the valley in 1838 later built cabins in Montana Territory, incorporating the double wall design. Settlers heading to Oregon country in the early 1840s sometimes stopped in the Wind River Valley and received advice on cabin building from Jonas and others. The knowledge dispersed gradually through the informal networks that connected mountain communities across thousands of miles. The specific techniques also continued adapting to different environments and materials. In regions where stone was scarce, builders used adobe bricks or thick packed earth for thermal mass. Where timber was limited, they used smaller logs and thicker insulation layers. In areas with different climate patterns, less extreme temperature swings, or different precipitation, the designs shifted accordingly. The underlying principles remained, but the implementation varied based on local conditions and available resources. Jonas himself continued refining his approach over the years. He added a small attached greenhouse on the south side of his cabin in the late 1830s, using it to extend his growing season for vegetables and provide additional passive heating in winter. He experimented with different chinking materials, eventually settling on a recipe that included small amounts of tallow for water resistance. He built a second stone fireplace for summer cooking, located outside to prevent heating the cabin unnecessarily in hot weather. By the time Jonas was in his 50s, his cabin had become something of a showpiece in the valley. Visitors often commented on how comfortable it was compared to other structures. Some tried to buy it from him, but Jonas always declined. He'd put too much work into the place, learned too many lessons from it to give it up. The cabin represented not just shelter, but accumulated knowledge and experience. The broader context of cabin design in the American frontier shows that Jonas's work was part of a larger evolution in building practices. Throughout the 1800s, settlers and builders gradually developed better methods for creating comfortable, durable structures in challenging environments. The rapid westward expansion meant people were constantly building in new climates and with unfamiliar materials, forcing adaptation and innovation. Regional variations in cabin design reflected different environmental challenges. In the Pacific Northwest's wet climate, builders focused on preventing moisture damage with steep roofs and raised foundations. In the hot, dry Southwest, thick adobe walls provided thermal mass and insulation. In the Great Plains, where timber was scarce, settlers built sodhouses, using the earth itself as both structure and insulation. Each region developed methods suited to its specific conditions. Jonas's contribution was specific to high-altitude mountain environments with extreme temperature swings and long, cold winters. His techniques addressed those particular challenges effectively, without requiring expensive materials or advanced tools. The design could be built by a single person with basic carpentry skills over the course of a summer. This accessibility meant the techniques spread readily among trappers and settlers who needed practical solutions, not elaborate construction. The legacy of this practical building knowledge continued through generations. Children who grew up in well-built cabins learned the principles behind the design. They carried that knowledge to their own building projects, sometimes improving on what they'd learned, sometimes simplifying for different circumstances. The oral tradition of sharing building techniques meant the knowledge remained alive and adaptable even without written documentation. Some of Jonas's direct descendants continued living in the Rocky Mountain region for decades. Their grandchildren told stories about the cabin their grandfather built, the one that stayed warm in winter without burning mountains of firewood, the one with the massive stone fireplace and the sod roof. Whether they fully understood the thermal principles involved or just knew that Grandpa built it smart didn't matter. The knowledge persisted in the form of structures that worked, methods that succeeded, and stories that taught. The transition from the trapping era to settled agriculture in the 1850s and beyond brought new approaches to building, but many of the lessons from the trapping days remained relevant. Farmers and ranchers building permanent homes in the mountains still faced extreme temperature swings. They still needed structures that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. The specific techniques evolved. Sawmills made dimensional lumber available. Manufactured materials provided new options. Better tools allowed more sophisticated construction. But the fundamental principles of working with climate rather than fighting it remained applicable. Modern visitors to historic sites sometimes see reconstructed trappers' cabins and mountain men dwellings. These structures often fail to capture the sophistication of the better-built examples. A simple log box with a fireplace at one end makes for an authentic-looking display. But it doesn't represent the evolved designs that mountain men actually built once they'd learned through hard experience what worked and what didn't. The difference between a first-year trapper's cabin and the structure he'd built after 5 years of mountain winters was dramatic. Jonas Fletcher's cabin, that carefully crafted structure in the Wind River Valley, eventually fell into disrepair after being abandoned in the 1860s. Weather and time took their toll. The sod roof collapsed first, Then the exposed wooden structure began to deteriorate. By the early 1900s, only the stone fireplace remained standing, a monument to the part of the structure that had been built to truly last. Even that was eventually buried by shifting soil and growing vegetation. But the knowledge Jonas developed and shared persisted long after the physical structure vanished. Trappers, settlers, and mountain dwellers across the Rockies continued using techniques that traced back in part to hard lessons learned in that valley in the 1830s. The specific attribution was lost. Few people decades later knew where certain building methods had originated, but the methods themselves continued working, which was all that mattered. The story highlights something important about innovation and knowledge sharing in frontier settings. Major breakthroughs didn't always come from professional builders or trained engineers. Sometimes the most valuable innovations came from observant people willing to learn from mistakes, listen to diverse knowledge sources, and experiment until they found better solutions. Jonas's combination of Swedish log building principles, indigenous construction knowledge, and practical carpentry created something more effective than any single tradition alone. It also demonstrates how environmental challenges forced adaptation. Jonas's first cabin would have been adequate in many environments. In the extreme conditions of the Wind River Valley at 8,000 feet, it was barely livable. The specific circumstances demanded better solutions, pushing Jonas to think creatively and combine different approaches. Necessity drove innovation, as it so often does. The fundamental lesson from Jonas Fletcher's work, that buildings can be designed to work with climate rather than simply resist it, remains relevant. Modern green building and passive house design follow similar principles. Use thermal mass to store and release heat strategically. Create insulated envelopes to prevent heat transfer. Design for natural ventilation when beneficial. Orient structures to take advantage of passive solar heating. These aren't new ideas. Mountain men in the 1830s understood these principles, even if they expressed them differently than modern engineers. Jonas died in 1881 at the age of 72, having lived far longer than most mountain men of his era. He'd seen the beaver trade boom and collapse. He'd witnessed the transformation of the mountain wilderness into settled territory. He'd watched railroads cut through valleys where only game trails had existed. Through all those changes, he remembered those early winters in the Wind River Valley, learning the hard way how to build a cabin that actually worked. In his later years, Jonas sometimes guided young builders who asked for advice on cabin construction. He'd share what he'd learned, explaining about double walls and thermal mass, about proper chinking and seasonal ventilation. Some listened carefully, others nodded politely and built whatever was quickest and easiest. Jonas didn't worry about it. He'd learned that people had to be cold enough times, had to burn enough extra firewood before they'd put in the effort to build properly. But for those who did listen and apply the principles, the reward was immediate and lasting. A cabin that stayed warm in winter without burning excessive firewood. A structure that remained cool in summer without requiring constant attention. A home that worked with the environment rather than fighting it. That was the real innovation. Understanding that a building could be more than just shelter from the elements. It could be a tool for managing climate, creating comfort and making survival a little bit easier. The techniques Jonas Fletcher developed and shared represented accumulated wisdom from multiple sources, adapted to specific conditions through trial and error. They weren't perfect solutions. No building method is, but they were significantly better than the standard approach most trappers used. And that improvement, multiplied across dozens or hundreds of cabins across years of winters and summers, represented a meaningful advancement in frontier living conditions. The mathematical reality of the improvement was straightforward, even if Jonas never calculated it precisely. His first cabin, burning 4 cords of wood per month during winter, required roughly 24 cords for a 6-month heating season. At the rate of 1 cord per day of hard work cutting and hauling, that represented 24 days of dangerous, exhausting labor. His improved cabin, using roughly 1.5 cords per month, needed only about 9 cords for the same period. 9 days of work instead of 24. That 15-day difference could be spent hunting, trapping, improving the homestead, or simply resting. The fuel efficiency also meant less deforestation around the cabin. Areas where trappers and settlers clustered often showed heavy impact on local forests from everyone cutting firewood. Cabins that used less wood reduced that pressure slightly. Over time, across multiple cabins, the cumulative impact was noticeable. Forests closer to settlements lasted longer. People didn't have to travel as far to find adequate timber. Other trappers and mountain men who visited Jonas's cabin often wanted to know exact specifications. How thick should the double wall be? How much thermal mass in the fireplace? What proportions for the chinking mixture? Jonas always gave approximate answers, because he'd learned that exact specifications mattered less than understanding the principles. A double wall could be 18 inches or 30 inches, depending on available materials and time. The fireplace mass needed to be significant, but could vary based on the size of the cabin and the quality of available stone. The chinking recipe could adapt based on what materials were actually available. This flexibility was crucial for spreading the techniques. If Jonas had insisted on exact specifications that required specific materials or measurements, fewer people could have adopted his methods. By teaching the underlying logic, trap air for insulation, store heat in mass, seal gaps to prevent drafts, he enabled others to adapt the techniques to their own situations. A trapper in a different valley with different available materials could still apply the same principles successfully. The construction timeline was another practical consideration. Jonas's improved cabin took most of a summer to build, working alone. That was a significant investment of time, especially for trappers who needed to be out working their trap lines. Some trappers couldn't spare that much time in a single season. They'd build their cabins in stages. Basic structure the first summer, improvements the second year, refinements the third. This incremental approach meant living in a less than ideal cabin initially, but it was more practical than trying to build everything perfectly from the start. Jonas often told people that the most important improvements were in order: proper chinking to eliminate drafts, positioning the fireplace to keep thermal mass inside the insulated envelope, and creating a raised floor to prevent ground cold from conducting upward. These 3 changes alone made dramatic differences and could be accomplished relatively quickly. The double walls, sawed roof, and other refinements added further benefits but required more time and materials. The seasonality of construction also mattered. Most trappers could only build during the relatively short mountain summer from June through September. This limited timeline meant working efficiently and prioritizing the most important elements. Jonas recommended starting with the foundation and floor, then the walls, then the roof, getting the structure weathertight before winter arrived. Refinements like improving the chinking or adding the sod layer to the roof could happen the following summer if necessary. Tool requirements were minimal, which helped spread the techniques. A good axe, a saw, an auger for drilling, a draw knife for shaping wood, and a shovel covered most needs. These were tools any trapper would already own. No specialized equipment or expensive materials were required. The stone for the fireplace came from nearby creeks or hillsides. The logs came from surrounding forests. The chinking materials, clay, sand, moss, grass, were freely available. Even the lime, the one potentially hard-to-get ingredient, could be substituted with other materials if necessary. The knowledge sharing happened informally through the trapper community. Rendezvous gatherings where trappers met annually to trade furs and resupply became venues for exchanging building techniques along with stories and news. A trapper who'd built an improved cabin would describe what he'd done. Others would ask questions, discuss modifications, debate the merits of different approaches. The information spread through this oral network, adapting and evolving as it moved from person to person and region to region. Women in the mountain communities often contributed their own knowledge to building design, though historical records rarely documented their contributions. Native American women, like Morning Crow, understood principles of thermal management from their own building traditions. Settler women brought knowledge from their Eastern or European backgrounds. The wives of trappers and settlers frequently had practical insights about what made a cabin actually livable. Kitchen layout, storage needs, light requirements, ventilation. These considerations influenced design decisions, even if they weren't discussed as explicitly as the technical aspects of insulation and heating. The children growing up in these improved cabins experienced a different frontier childhood than those in poorly built structures. Being warm enough to sleep comfortably, having space inside to work on projects during winter months, living in a structure that didn't require constant maintenance. These small improvements in daily life conditions had cumulative effects on health, education, and general well-being. Children could practice reading or arithmetic inside during winter instead of huddling under blankets trying to stay warm. This educational opportunity, seemingly minor, represented a real difference in life outcomes. By the mid-1840s, as the Oregon Trail brought increasing numbers of settlers through the mountain regions, some immigrants stopped to learn from the trappers and mountain men who'd been living there for years. Building techniques developed for trapping cabins influenced the construction of early settler homes along the trail and in Oregon country. The knowledge moved west with the wagon trains, carried by people who'd spent a winter or two in the mountains and learned what worked. The transition from single trappers' cabins to family homesteads brought new considerations. Larger structures needed different approaches to heating and insulation. Multiple rooms required thinking about how heat moved through interior spaces. Growing families needed more space but faced the same constraints on firewood and building materials. The basic principles Jonas had worked out still applied, but they scaled up and adapted to new circumstances. Some settlers built what amounted to expanded versions of trappers' cabins. The same double-wall construction and interior thermal mass, but in a larger footprint with multiple rooms. Others built more conventional structures, but incorporated specific elements like improved chinking or raised floors. The techniques became part of the broader vocabulary of frontier building, mixed in with knowledge from other sources and traditions. The economic aspects of better cabin design rarely get discussed, but were significant. A cabin that used half as much firewood represented real cost savings in terms of labor. A structure that lasted longer without major repairs meant less time and materials spent on maintenance. A warmer, healthier living space potentially reduced medical expenses and lost work time from illness. While frontier people rarely calculated these costs precisely, they understood intuitively that a well-built cabin was an investment that paid returns over years. The satisfaction of living in a structure that actually worked well shouldn't be discounted either. After years of fighting with a cabin that stayed cold and drafty, the experience of warmth and comfort represented a real quality of life improvement. Jonas mentioned in letters to family back east that his improved cabin felt like a real home rather than just a shelter. That psychological difference, the ability to relax and feel comfortable in your own space, had value beyond simple survival. The technical knowledge also represented a form of wealth that could be shared or traded. A trapper known for building good cabins might help others with their construction in exchange for other goods or services. Settlers new to the mountains would seek out experienced builders for advice. The knowledge had social currency, creating relationships and obligations within the community. Jonas helped several younger trappers improve their cabins over the years, building friendships and alliances that proved valuable in the isolated mountain environment. The story of Jonas Fletcher's cabin innovations also illustrates how historical knowledge gets lost and rediscovered. By the early 1900s, as modern construction techniques and materials became standard, many of the specific methods developed by mountain men were forgotten. Later generations interested in historical building sometimes had to rediscover principles that trappers in the 1830s had understood perfectly well. The knowledge cycle, innovation, adoption, routine use, eventual loss, rediscovery, played out over decades. Modern reconstruction efforts at historical sites sometimes miss these sophistications. A mountain man cabin built for tourists often represents the most basic construction, because builders assume that's what trappers used. The evolved, refined techniques that made mountain living actually sustainable get overlooked. This creates a misleading impression of frontier life as more primitive than it actually was. The best frontier builders were sophisticated problem solvers who developed effective solutions to real challenges. The environmental knowledge embedded in these building techniques deserves recognition. Understanding how cold air pools and valleys, how wind patterns affect building sites, how sun angles change with seasons, how moisture moves through materials, all this represented detailed observation of natural patterns. Mountain men like Jonas developed this knowledge through direct experience, learning to read the environment and work with it rather than against it. The contrast between Jonas's two cabins, the first built quickly using standard methods, the second built carefully using refined techniques, demonstrates the value of learning from failure. His first winter was miserable, but it taught him what didn't work. His willingness to acknowledge mistakes and try different approaches led to eventual success.
This pattern repeated across the frontier as people learned through experience what building methods succeeded in their specific environment. The legacy of these building innovations extended into the 20th century through what's sometimes called vernacular architecture, buildings designed and constructed by their users rather than professional architects. Ranchers and homesteaders in the Mountain West continued using double-wall construction, interior thermal mass, and other techniques developed during the trapping era. The knowledge persisted as practical tradition even after its origins were forgotten. Jonas Fletcher's contribution was ultimately about sharing knowledge rather than keeping secrets. He could have kept his building techniques to himself, maintaining an advantage over other trappers.
Instead, he freely explained what he'd learned, helping others improve their own living conditions. This generosity reflected the cooperative ethic necessary for survival in the harsh mountain environment. When everyone's cabins worked better, everyone was safer and more likely to survive the winter. The story ends not with Jonas's death in 1881, but with the ongoing use of principles he helped develop and spread. Modern builders interested in energy-efficient, climate-responsive design rediscover many of the same techniques. Passive solar design, thermal mass, insulation strategies, natural ventilation. These contemporary green building principles would have been perfectly understandable to Jonas Fletcher. He might not have used the same terminology, but he understood the concepts through direct experience. The fundamental insight remains valuable. Buildings should be designed to work with their environment, rather than simply resisting it. Understanding how heat moves, how materials behave, how seasons change, and how natural forces interact. These principles enable creating structures that are more comfortable, more efficient, and more sustainable. Jonas Fletcher learned these lessons the hard way, freezing through a Rocky Mountain winter in a poorly built cabin. His willingness to observe, experiment, learn from others, and share what he discovered created knowledge that spread through the mountain communities and influenced frontier building for generations. That's the real story. Not just one mountain man's improved cabin, but the accumulation and sharing of knowledge that made frontier life more livable. Jonas Fletcher was one contributor among many, working out solutions to problems faced by everyone trying to build homes in the extreme conditions of the high mountains. His specific techniques mattered less than his approach. Observe carefully, learn from mistakes, combine knowledge from different sources, understand underlying principles rather than just following procedures, and share what you learn so others can benefit. The cabin that started it all, that carefully built structure in the Wind River Valley with its double walls and massive stone fireplace, is long gone. But the knowledge it represented, the understanding of how to build structures that stay warm in winter and cool in summer without burning excessive fuel, that knowledge survived. It moved through the trapper community, influenced settler construction, persisted in vernacular building traditions, and eventually reconnected with formal architectural and engineering principles. Jonas Fletcher would probably be surprised to learn that his building techniques would be remembered or discussed nearly 2 centuries later. He was just trying to stay warm, to make his life a little more comfortable in a harsh environment. But in solving that personal problem, he contributed to a body of knowledge that helped countless others facing similar challenges. That's the nature of practical innovation on the frontier. Individuals solving immediate problems, sharing solutions, and collectively developing knowledge that makes survival not just possible, but sustainable.